Hello, everyone. This is Colleen Lumsden, and on behalf of Security and 451 Research, I'd like to welcome you and say thanks for attending today's webcast titled Robotic Automation for CCPA Compliance and Beyond with PrivacyOps. Leading off the discussion today will be Paige Bartley, who's Senior Analyst of Data Management at 451 Research. Following Paige will be Rehan Jalil, who is CEO at Security. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. The presentation slides are available for download in the resources section on your screen. And finally, please check back for the on-demand version of this webinar after the conclusion of the live event. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paige.
So hello and welcome to the webinar. As was mentioned, I'm Paige Bartley. I'm a Senior Analyst with the Data, AI, and Analytics team at 451 Research. 451 Research is an industry analysis firm where we do research primarily on IT. I won't walk through the entire deck here, but I think the important thing to note is we're a very data-centric organization in analyzing the technology space. We have excellent survey cycles that go out, analyze the consumer space as well as the enterprise space, looking at practitioners within organizations, seeing how they use technology and those perceptions around technology, and we'll be using some of that data today. The question I'd like to begin with is how did we get to where we are? And I think there's some very powerful data here that we pulled from our consumer research, which is called Voice of the Connected User Landscape. Primarily here we were looking at more of our leading indicator panel, which is traditionally more of an early adopter set of consumers. But this is some pretty startling data when you look at it. About 90% of consumers, at least in our fairly large survey set here, are concerned about privacy to some extent when it comes to their interactions with businesses and organizations and basically the modern tech-enabled lifestyle. Very few don't have an opinion about it. This is very, very much a rising tide in public perception around data privacy. And as we see regulations like GDPR and CCPA evolve and surface, it's important to remember that this is largely being driven by the consumer awareness. Governments are not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. This is something that is impossible to ignore, and that consumers are becoming more aware, and that's driving change. So as consumers have increased concerns around data privacy, they're going to modify their behaviors, change their interactions with organizations, and even change their spending patterns with businesses. And as a business, that's something that is very much an issue you want to be concerned with. And CCPA is just the first of many U.S. privacy regulations. So CCPA has occasionally been likened to America's GDPR. And at a very philosophical level, that is true to some extent. They obviously differ in their nuances and approaches, but CCPA is similar to GDPR in the sense that California is using its economic heft as a state within the U.S. to try to force standards upon other states. And last time I checked, I think California is about 12% of the U.S. population. But essentially, if you're doing interstate business in California, you likely are going to have California residents as customers, and this means CCPA affects you. But what we're seeing now in this list of laws is that there's a balkanization and a proliferation of laws as other states come to realize that consumers are very concerned about privacy. California was a first mover, and it's having the intended effect, kind of a domino effect of pushing these other regulations into the legislative system and being considered. So, New York and Washington are good examples, whereas the New York law may actually potentially be a stronger law than CCPA. All of that still has to be settled. CCPA itself was just recently essentially signed into law by the governor. So there are a lot of moving pieces going on, and a strategy just to address one of these regulations is not going to be sustainable. And importantly, as I alluded to, CCPA applies to companies outside of California. So right here we have essentially the three main criteria that if one of them are met, means the organization is going to be subject to CCPA. We could do a deep dive here if we had more time, but essentially CCPA is going to be a little bit more protective of smaller organizations than, say, a regulation like GDPR. That's partially because of the startup industry in California, but it still is casting a very wide net. So if you're a very small organization, but you derive 50% or more of your annual revenue from selling consumers' personal information, you could be essentially a good example might be a lot of smartphone apps where their primary purpose is collecting and selling data. You could be a very small organization, have this apply to you, but it's going to affect you if you do business with a California resident. And not only are California residents found everywhere, when they travel, when they engage with businesses across the country, it's residency in the U.S. is a very hard thing to pin down. It's easy for residents of one state to become residents of another state, and as an organization that's having to comply, now it's on you to be able to keep track of all of this and figure out if a certain individual has these rights based in California. But at the heart of these privacy regulations, whether it be CCPA or GDPR or the Brazilian law that's now out there, it's about rights to data held by companies for the individual. So oftentimes this is encapsulated in the phrase the right to know and the right to say no. So the right to know about what is being done with your data, what data is being held, and the right to say no to that data being either processed or sold to third parties or further manipulated. So these are some of the core rights here. Right to opt out and restrict use. Many regulations, for instance, CCPA and GDPR, differ on where in that data life cycle you're allowed to opt out, but the fundamental requirement is still there that the data subject or the consumer has that right to opt out at one point or another. And as an organization trying to comply, you'll definitely have to have those capabilities to not only collect that consent from the consumer or the data subject or the individual, but keep track of it and actually apply that to the data that's being managed so that they can exert their rights. Right to data portability is a major common thread across data privacy regulations. Ability to move your data from one service to another. Right to have basic security around data is another big one. So generally speaking, regulations will say that it's expected that you use industry standard security for that appropriate era to protect that data. And then if a breach does happen, that individual or that consumer has the right to be notified so that they know and can take appropriate action if they feel there may have been sensitive data that was let out into the wild. So this is difficult. Personal data in modern data management architecture spreads internally and externally. It propagates like wild. So initially you have an enterprise or an organization that is collecting data and pulling that data into the organization. That data is going to then propagate into internal systems, which may be your traditional RDBMS systems, on-premise databases, non-relational, whatever it may be, all of your on-premise systems, file shares, things like that. But then it's also going to go out to other organizations as well in most cases, especially within larger businesses. You're going to have business partnerships and things like that where you may have data sharing agreements. It'll go out to other vendors. And then additionally, if you're, using cloud SaaS services, things like CRM, it's going to get populated out to those as well. And in this chain of data sharing and data propagation and data copies, each link in this chain is going to be a weak point that a nefarious actor could potentially leverage and take advantage of this data that's being passed along. And at the end of the day, that means consumers are going to be impacted. And as an organization, as a business, collecting that personal data initially, now there's some level of responsibility for this entire chain of data custody as data gets passed along amongst systems. So it's really a difficult challenge to tackle, because if a consumer requests the right to delete some of their information, not only do you have that information in your internal systems, you potentially have this entire chain of external parties involved where you have to contact and negotiate and make sure that that data is actually removed from potentially an entire web of other organizations. So the key takeaway here is that data is generally more difficult to control than ever before. And I think we have some really good data from our enterprise research, which is called Voice of the Enterprise, done by 451 Research, that looks at business adoption and practices around technology. And this is one data point. This is just about use of the public cloud. But if we look at the data here, 72% of organizations, ranging from small to large, are using more than one public cloud provider. And again, that's just the cloud. That's just having data in the public cloud. Just imagine all of the systems that are on premise. And even amongst those organizations, you might expect that most of them are doing, having almost all of their data in one cloud provider. It's actually only about 45% that are doing 80 to 100% of their data within that primary cloud vendor. So the point is, if you have data anywhere, that data is now your responsibility. And as we diversify the options of where we can put data, multi-cloud and hybrid strategies becoming the norm, it becomes even more difficult to balance all of those requirements. This leads to a perfect storm. So there's a need for better control of data within organizations. And we're not just talking about personal data or personally identifiable information. This is all data. So as organizations are trying to become more data-driven, trying to leverage data across the organization, trying to enable things like self-service, there needs to be full control of data. And if you look at a regulation, data privacy, data protection regulation like GDPR, CCPA, or name your favorite regulation, at the end of the day, they're generally asking for better control of data as their core mandate. And there's some synergies here with ongoing business initiatives, because businesses also need to ensure data quality and relevance. So if you have better control of your data, that's going to be easier to ensure. You have an exponentially growing number of data consumers within most organizations. So business users accessing and leveraging data more than they ever have in the past. You want to make sure that you can control who can access what, but make that invisible to the user so that they can still get their job done. And of course, the reason we're here today is the regulatory and compliance efforts. So really, this perfect storm for having better control of data is a nexus and really an opportunity if you think about it. It's not just meeting compliance requirements. It's an opportunity to optimize data management and practices from the ground up. But how are we going to do this? So automation is absolutely going to be critical. There's really no way to scale to the modern volume of data and the complexity of processes that we have today if you're depending on manual methods that are error-prone, costly, and slow. And I like to point to sort of the traditional triumvirate when we think of technology and processes within organizations. It's, achieving compliance with a regulation like CCPA is not just about plugging in a point solution. It's an entire process and workflow. So you have people, process, and technology, and there's elements of automation for all of those. So if you're trying to implement manual methods for everything, you're not going to be able to scale, you're not going to be able to adapt, and all of the problems associated with manual methods are going to increase the risk of privacy violations along the way, impact your consumer trust, and ultimately that can impact the value of your brand if consumers lose trust in your organization. So how do we approach this? PrivacyOps is sort of the modern approach to going about this, and more of a framework. So you're going to want to operationalize privacy compliance across the organization. Again, that's going back to people, process, and technology, not just plugging in a technology solution. And I think one of the things that's important to point out here is that there has to be an externally facing element, right? So you need an system of engagement with the individuals who have those data rights, whether they be consumers under CCPA or under GDPR. Those could even be employees or contractors. You need a method of interacting systematically with them. So that could be, collecting their consent, collecting their requests to gain access to information, so data subject requests. You need to be able to verify identity. So there was a big headline at the Black Hat conference earlier this year where a researcher put in a bunch of fraudulent requests for data pretending to be someone else, and many of those organizations gave over that data, which is an even more egregious violation of privacy than, just processing that data. So you need to be aware of identity verification that's appropriate for the sensitivity of data that the individual is trying to access. Getting that data to the individuals who have the rights to it, and then also externally facing, making sure that you automate that communication in the case of a potential breach. So all of these steps have potential for automation to some extent. Making sure those communications are fluid and getting individuals the information and the data that they deserve. And then there's a system for automation of fulfilling privacy requirements in general. So you have fulfilling those data subject requests, getting data to the right people, fulfilling consent changes. So a person may decide that they previously were okay with you selling data to a third party, and now they're going to opt out. How do you account for that change? How do you make sure that information propagates to all the right people within the workflow and within the right systems? Another big thing is third-party vendor risk assessment. So assessing vendors that you work with or business partners that you work with, assessing the risk that's there. How do you automate that, collect that data, assess that data on a rolling basis? And then again, breach notification is a big one in terms of automation, because you could potentially have to notify millions of individuals if something goes wrong. And then a system of record. Under GDPR, there's a very specific article that's about record keeping, but under CCP, it's very similar as well, where you have, basically, you need to be able to document everything that you're doing. Compliance is irrelevant if you can't demonstrate that you are in compliance. And a big part of demonstrating that you are in compliance is the system of record. So how do you manage your consent records, automate their collection and automate their management? How do you collect records around data subject requests, keeping track of who has requested what data? How do you have a dossier on the vendors that you deal with, and that assessment there, to have a record kept of of risk assessment